All right, let's go ahead and get started. So again, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, Role-Based Access Control for SSH and Kubernetes Access with Teleport, brought to you by Gravitational. I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Stephen Martin. Stephen is an experienced solution engineer at Gravitational with over 20 years of enterprise and IT experience. He has led multiple large enterprise application implementations at corporate and government sites using on-prem and cloud resources. And I'd like to pass it off to Stephen for the presentation.
Thank you. Okay. Well, first off, I'm going to step you through just a high-level agenda as I take you through RBAC for SSH and Kubernetes in Teleport. We'll be doing some hands-on demoing as well, so don't worry, it's not just going to be slides. First off, we'll do a brief overview of Teleport so you can get a good understanding of what this solution offers. We'll be going into why do we use role-based access in Teleport versus there are certainly other types of control that you can do for these type of solutions. I think you'll see that Teleport allows you to incorporate other ones as well, given that we're using role-based access control. Now, we'll also show you in depth in terms of how you define roles in Teleport, how they let you control which nodes users and service users can access, as well as the Kubernetes settings. There are a number of controls that you can use here, and many of our customers find them very helpful in defining what's allowed and not allowed in terms of accessing your resources. And as I said, we'll be going through some really hands-on demonstration with different types of roles, showing escalating privileges for users that allows you to really fulfill, typically the goal of a zero trust environment. Now, first off, I want to introduce you to Teleport. Teleport is a simple, secure access solution for getting to your Kubernetes and SSH resources. As you can see here, this is an overall diagram of a Teleport deployment. On the left, you have our typical types of users, which are developers, testers, administrators. There's also, as I mentioned, typically service users. So a service user could be a automated process used that might be accessing something like Jenkins or performing other type of automated job. And so instead of, typically up to now, a lot of organizations have used static keys or passwords to access various SSH resources, and Gravitational chose to go for a certificate-based approach. And there's several reasons for that, namely that certificates allow you to box in a specific time that you're authenticated for. You can include a lot of other metadata in a particular certificate, defining things like what logins a person has, other information. And by doing that, after a user is issued a certificate, the certificate is then portable, but again, still time boxed. So instead of a user getting one static key that could be used for years and years, each time they authenticate, they're given a particular certificate for a number of hours, and then that is reflective of their current role access. Now, in terms of how the system is used, users and service users would interact through the web, kubectl for Kubernetes. We also offer our own command line for SSH, TSH. There's also, we can also interact and natively support SSH interactions, so you can still use your regular SSH and SCP interaction. And as I mentioned, each user is issued a certificate. They work with the Auth gateway, also called the proxy, and that is your main interaction in terms of the web UI, as well as how the command line will first authenticate and then integrate in terms of issuing SSH or Kubernetes protocols. We have another component, as you see on the right, called the Auth service. So being certificate-based, Teleport maintained its own cert authority. So when you first install a Teleport, it will create its own certificate and maintain that. That certificate can be rotated and new ones installed, but that certificate is maintained in a secure manner And that's what's used to issue those short-lived certificates, and then allows the Auth gateway to confirm when a user goes through that this is a valid user and they should be allowed to access the resources they're requesting. In addition, the Auth service is maintaining the state of the system, what roles are defined, what users, what we call Auth connectors. As you can see, the connection to an identity manager, such as an Azure AD, an Auth 0, or any other number of SAML or OIDC based. We also support GitHub. If you're not aware, GitHub allows for free usage for teams. That can be very useful in terms of besides SAML or OIDC based SSOs. Now, besides having the roles that we define and the usage that are statically done, we also have the idea of approval workflows. So you can see at the top a Slack icon and approve or deny. And I put that specifically using Slack because my demonstration will include Slack. So typically a person gets a particular set of access, maybe to developer nodes, maybe to testing or staging, but often they need a way to access more sensitive systems or systems that may need their help, like in a production outage or investigating an issue. And that's where our approval workflow comes in. So whether in Teleport or one of our supported plugins like Slack, a person can request a specific other role, like prod access or perhaps staging, and receive that role. Again, they receive a short-lived certificate with those credentials, and then they're able to access that system. Now, as I go through and talk about roles, I want to give some ideas about best practices there, where you don't always want to give a user, when they're investigating, directly access to alter resources or be able to change those resources. But often you want to initially give them logging access, the ability to investigate, see what's happening in the environment, just being able to log onto the box and see logs, see the memory usage and performance of the system. And then once they've diagnosed the issue, then give them the access, if they're only individuals able to do it, to alter it. Now, I think you'll also see, as I go through the system, ways that you can enforce things like two-person rules, where you don't just allow a person into a system that is sensitive without others monitoring them. Now, as part of Teleport's solution, we offer the audit log approach that logs when a person has done particular actions, such as started an SSH session or joined in sessions. But also something different to actually allow a person to go through and access the same system in real time and see as they navigate and what decisions they're making. Now, before I go forward with more slides, I just want to give you a taste of actually being in Teleport. So this is the web interaction, or as I mentioned, the Auth gateway or proxy. And I'm going to use the Auth 0 single sign-on. And that's convenient. It's tied into our Google accounts. And you can see here I can choose a set of clusters. I'm going to go first into our example root cluster. And I'll explain about this idea of clusters a little later. Now, once I'm in the system, I see the set of nodes that I'm able to access. And you can see that they're labeled. They have particular names. And then there's individual labels that tell me, do they have a unique ID? Do they have a particular, in this case, tier, and then type? And this is both informational as used for the role-based access. So a user might have access just to tier dev, or they may have a combination of saying, well, you can see dev and apps and staging and apps, but you don't actually have access to databases. And then to open up the system, I can see, well, what users is available for me. I open up an SSH session. I can check for things, well, what programs are running. I can see I'm running a particular Python script, and we'll come back to this particular script in a bit, which is going to cause us a little trouble in the demonstration. Now, once I'm in here, I can open up other SSH tabs very easily. I can navigate to other clusters, and other clusters are individual deployments of Teleport that allow me to have standalone instances, their own roles and access, but I'm still trusting back to a root. And that allows you, whether you're doing a regional deployment or you're doing particular isolated deployments where you only want nodes to connect to one particular teleport, that can be very helpful. Now, as I'm in this environment, whatever I do here is recorded. And once I end that session, I can go back and look at the audit log, and I can replay it. And it replays as I did it. It's also efficient in that it speeds ahead for if there's long pauses, as a person works. So I think this went a little faster than I was in there. All of this information is exportable out to other SIEM in real time or post-analysis. Now, also, I can also see, well, if I had other active sessions, those would be available. And then I also have my control of the system, such as what roles are defined. I will be coming back to these, like the dev role that can see dev nodes, a production, and then some other examples. Now the auth connector here, that's what's allowing me to connect in with Auth0. And I can define more than one. And in some cases, such as having external parties, you may not want them to be going through the same single sign-on as your internal users. So that gives you a lot of flexibility to be able to define a separate SSO mapping as opposed to having all users go through one. Now, often users who do SSH and Kubernetes are doing it from the command line. So, here's an example of, as I mentioned before, we have this TSH command line tool, and that allows us to look to, well, I've already authenticated here. In this case, this is a user, unlike the one you just saw, that has limited access to dev, and they have particular logins. So their set of nodes is much less. They can only see tier dev and tier app or build. You notice that we have this address item. So address means how is the proxy getting to this particular node? And one is, this is exposing a DNS name and a port. In this case, it's using a tunnel. So teleports support using a reverse tunnel approach through the proxy, and often that's useful if you have a NAT, an IoT device, or simply more restrictive network environment. Now to open up a sessions, I can simply do TSH SSH. Give the node name, and I'm in a session. Now, once I've opened that session is available from the list of active sessions. I can see what user is in here and what node they're on, how long they've been there, and if I have access, I can join the session. So we can see here everything I type is available to that user and vice versa. We can also see in here who's been in the session. And again, this can be part of perhaps a two-person rule or simply training where you want to walk someone through an environment and troubleshoot together. Now, if I close this session, it will not exit the session, but it's part of the audit logging to show that someone has both joined and disconnected. And now stepping back here, we're going to exit here. And in addition to getting a short-lived certificate, we also were given a certificate used as part of our Kubernetes Access. So this user can access pods within the dev namespace in an EKS cluster that we've connected to. So you can see here I have 2 pods running, but this user is restricted in that they can list pods and they can watch for logs, but they are restricted if they attempt to open exec sessions. And we'll show in a little bit later, how they could actually get in and ask for that privilege to do that and perform it. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and attempt it, and we'll see if our security holds. Yep, and this user is not allowed to do that because they're only given the pods list and get access in their role definition. Okay. And just stepping back through the presentation. Now, in terms of, again, why to use role-based access? Role-based access allows for really centralizing, determining what control is allowed across users. Things like, what particular nodes are you to access, and then what actions are you able to do within those particular resources. And that centralized approach really works well outside of some other examples like discretionary or mandatory. Now, discretionary is often associated with Windows in that you're defining that an owner can define who can access and what they can do. And an issue with that is simply that there's so many objects, thousands or even millions within a typical enterprise that can cause issues trying to maintain that list. Now, mandatory is often associated with military or classified type systems where you can only do specific things if you have certain classification levels. Now, often an issue with that particular approach is that you're trying to maintain all of the different classifications, and if a new classification comes out, you have to broadcast that to all of the various resources and make sure that they're in line with that new classification. Now, a good thing about role-based access is that you have some control there of, yes, it is centralized, but you can put in particular controls within the resources themselves, such as in some cases, like with the SSH node, you may enforce that, well, yes, you're in the system, but if you want to have a second factor when a user connects to the node, you can integrate that with PAM. And that's something Teleport supports out of the box is PAM integration, such as creating users or requiring that, besides creating users or confirming a user's role, it can also offer a challenge that, well, you have to provide a second factor, Duo, YubiKey, and provide that before your user is completely authenticated and given a session. So we found that using role-based access really provides the best across the various access control approaches, and also allows you to use other factors from different types of access controls to allow you the most flexibility. Now, in terms of how Teleport defines these roles and uses them, first there's the concepts of what you're allowing and denying. And by default, everything is denied in Teleport. And you're really defining what you allow. Do you allow them to connect to particular node types, whether it's star, meaning all labels, or defining a particular regular expression like dev-star or some other combination. Now, there's also, well, what can you do in there? Are you allowing port forwarding? Are you allowing forward agenting? Are you limiting the number of connections they can have? So all of those, more sort of low-level things you run into with SSH that you want to allow. The next is, and I mentioned it before about, well, it's great to give me access to dev and testing, but what about a production outage? What about if I need to troubleshoot these various environments? Then I don't want to give you that access, even view-only access by default, but we allow you to be able to request those roles. And that's part of our approval workflow, in that a person who's normally in a dev environment can be able to request the prod, but then another individual has to approve that to allow that to happen. And as you see, often it's best not to give them the access to be able to alter production, but first be able to, view what's in production and then request to get access where they can actually change it and resolve the issue. Now, next is, what node labels do you want to use? Things like you saw that I have particular dev labeling for certain nodes and also the type there. And Teleport allows you to do multiple labeling, not just simply one or two, as many as you want. I'd say, best practice, you'll want to keep that typically, below 10, and some combination that is both informational as well as functional in terms of how you're doing your categorization. Now, one thing, as a general practice is don't try to put everything in one role. Often users will typically have more than one role based on their day-to-day working. And we've seen where sometimes trying to fit that all into one simply doesn't work, and it's best to try to do different combinations, and then maybe later you can consolidate them. But we don't try to make it so one entire job can fit into a single role. Next is the logins. As you saw, perhaps app user. You certainly can have it the individual user, like my name's Steven, can be in there. In my demonstration, I would be using more individual static names, but we allow from an SSO or even local users the ability to use personalized names. Next is, what kind of Kubernetes access you have. We support groups as well as IAM users. Again, more you have individual usage, and that's really up to how you like to define. We find some customers have a lot of different clusters, prefer to go more the IAM user route. Others, like the idea of using groups and particular roles that are bound to those groups. And it's simply more up to a preference. I would say, it's good to be consistent across those so there isn't confusion. But Teleport has ways of making it so if you do have different mapping across your Kubernetes clusters, you certainly can access them. As I said, sometimes it's best to have that across different roles than trying to consolidate it into one. Now, one important thing as part of that certificate-based authentication is your time to live. So how long should a person actually have a certificate? The user I had there was 8 hours. Now, if you're going into a more sensitive system, you may want to limit that to something like 1 hour. Users can also control when they authenticate if they want to take it down below their actual time to live. Perhaps they're going to reuse that certificate in another system, so they want to limit how long it is. Certificates are portable, so once I authenticate, I can reuse that from another system. So there could be a reason for authenticating once and then limiting that time. And lastly is, what can I do in Teleport to administer? And as you saw, there's the roles pages, there's auth connectors, there's the actual audit log. Can I see other sessions? So basically being able to control what users can see following the typical CRUDL model. Can they maintain them? Can they see them? Can they list them? And I'd say for the most part, especially the roles, it's a good idea to allow users to see roles and be able to understand, well, what was their definition? Why do they see certain nodes and not others? Why do they not have root access? And just like a regular Linux system, being able to really understand the system as opposed to it being fully black box. Now let's go through in terms of how we define it in Teleport. And Teleport uses YAML for its definitions. That allows, as I can from the web interaction, pretty simple interface. It's also very helpful if you have a automated approach like with Puppet or Terraform, where you can easily apply these files. Teleport supports the use of a bootstrap approach. So if I update a particular role, it's easy to reapply that. And first we're going to start with very simple, literally named simple role. In this case, I'm saying a user can get into the developer Kubernetes groups. They can log in with Ubuntu, and I'm saying if they have a node that has a label type of dev, they can see that. And some other options like is port forwarding on. So this is a very simple role definition, and it'll get you access. You won't be able to see things like roles or others because, as I said before, Teleport denies by default. But the good thing about it is you can get up and going very quickly with very simple definitions that do make you secure. Now, past that, you typically get in a situation where you want a little more sophisticated. In this case, we're adding on that, and you can see in the middle, the user can request production, so they can get access to a production role, and that likely has type prod labeling. We've also added in the max connection, max sessions. So max connections is saying this user can, across a single Teleport instance, have 5 SSH sessions. If they go beyond that, the system will give them an error and say you're not allowed to exceed that. And in with those sessions, they can open up 5 sessions in there. Now, if we go to another level of defining a role, we've incorporated some of the external tagging. So often, as you saw, I use an Auth 0. There's often metadata coming from that for first off maps to the role you have, and then also has metadata, whether it's individual values or a list of values. And Teleport supports populating that into things like Kubernetes groups and logins. There's plenty of other settings you can do, but these are just some example. And you simply have to tag it with external dot, and then it'll auto-populate here. Now, one thing I added here was denying. So denial takes precedence. And what I'm saying here is, well, that's great that you have a set of users coming in from the single sign-on, but I want to make sure that you didn't define root there, and that those will always be denied. So even if root is in this list, it will not be available to the user. And then lastly, now we're incorporating the set of resources within Teleport that you're able to do here. So this user can see roles and review them. It can see the audit log, and it can see the active sessions. But you'll notice that there's no update verb here. So we're restricting that you can see them, but you can't actually maintain them. And again, that's helpful if you want to make it easier for users to understand the system they're in and why they may have certain permissions or be denied others. Now, in terms of a little more delving into how we map from a single sign-on to a role, and then the metadata, it's really a one-to-many relationship. So in the case of your particular identity provider, you might have a user like Jeff. He's got some metadata in there, Jeff, an email, list of groups he has, and that's an individual user. He's part of particular groups or roles, like an example of developer and DB admin. And in some cases, those are individual code names like developer. It might have an ID number, like you end up with Azure AD, whatever the combination. So within Teleport, we have the Auth connector. And the Auth connector is what uses the SAML, OIDC, or GitHub format to authenticate itself with the provider. We use the provider's pages to authenticate you, such as you might have second factor in addition to a username and password. And then we're receiving back the traits or claims. And that's what allows us to map to such as that dev role, a builder role, and perhaps a dev DB. Now, beyond the actual just mapping of the roles, we also get those traits that allow us to populate things like usernames in the Kubernetes groups. So you can decide whether or not you want to control more of that at the IDP level, or you want to more statically define that within the Teleport roles. That's up to you. And also, the thing to keep in mind is, again, you can have more than one SSO. There's no limit on the number of SSOs you have. And often that's helpful if you have those external parties that you want them going through separate providers. Excuse me. Now, once you get that role assigned to you, that will then allow you to access these resources. Excuse me. Now, the earlier one I mentioned something about trusted clusters. And trusted clusters are those separate instances of Teleport that are standalone, have their own individual roles, have their own SSH nodes, and perhaps Kubernetes clusters they're attaching to. And part of that is you can trust back to another root cluster. A instance can also trust to multiple clusters. And the reason you would often do that is if you don't want a particular Teleport instance directly available, either in your intranet or internet, and you want that connecting through another instance. You might have a very different environment where certain Teleport instances are running, if they're on different clouds, if they're geographically separate. And one of the powerful things is that those roles do not need to match each other. So one dev role in my root environment could be different than the dev role in another environment. Now, often from a best practice point of view, you don't want them too wildly different. Dev shouldn't mean production in a different cluster, but often you do want it to mirror that. But let's say you may not want to allow port forwarding in another environment, but you do want them to be able to see type dev nodes. Now, by having that separate and mapping, you're then able to give access across multiple instances easily, both for the web and the command line. And that's a fairly easy way to maintain the system. Many of our clients decide to deploy that way. They also, in some cases, decide that users can individually log in to those other clusters. And it's usually the same type of auth connector used. It's simply up to you if you do want to allow that kind of access. And I'd say the only overhead there is usually maintaining those auth connectors and the roles, and then whether or not it's safe to have those network connections available. So now let's go back into working in the environment and seeing some of the typical issues we might see. So in this case, as you saw, we have a tier dev, staging, and prod. In this case, we've been reported that we are seeing an issue in our prod, and the behavior of the application is not as we expect. And we'd like our developer to investigate, what's going on and why we might be seeing different behavior. So first off, the developer is going to, and let's refresh ourselves. This user has a dev role. They have these particular logins. And these are the nodes they can see. So they're running a particular Python application, and they're going to check to see whether or not that Python application is working the way they expect. So first we're going to see, well, what am I running here? What version am I running in my dev environment? Because everything's working well. And okay, I'm running this particular Python script. It's version 2. Well, I'd like to go see, well, what's running in production, and verify, is the same version running there? Are they seeing problems, or is it something we need to update to the latest version? So we're going to come back and let's take a look back at how that role was defined. So this role can request a few different other roles: staging, prod, and monitor. And the monitor role is meant to allow a user that can get into the system but is not actually an owner of a process or able to alter data. And prod would actually allow them to stop or start processes, as well as maintaining data. So as a regular developer, I might say, well, I want to get into production, see what's going on. He's going to request access to that, and he does that through saying request roles. In this case, we'll just say prod. And now we have a request seeking the approval. We have a unique ID. Using our Slack plugin, this is going to appear in our private channel. And this is one of the integrations we support, along with Jira, Mattermost, GitLab. We'd recommend in Slack using a private channel, because then the people in this channel can approve or deny. Now in this case, we're going to see, well, he's asking for prod. It's the first time I've heard from this user. I'm going to actually deny this, because this user should not be jumping directly into prod. And let's say we have a little side dialogue about the proper way to do things, and we can see that it's denied. Say, oh, right, I'm supposed to use that monitor role. Let me do the right thing. So again, we get a request. We get a new message saying, okay, he's asking for monitor. Now we're doing the right thing. I will approve. If we take a list, now we can see all of the servers, but you'll notice that we just have that new user monitor. So that monitor user is able to get into these environments, but not actually alter things once in the environment. So now we're in as the monitor. We can check to see, well, what application is running. Oh, we can see where it looks like the application went down, probably because it was the wrong version. So we will need to restart the application. And because it's the monitor user, he can't actually access the right one. So we're going to exit. We talk to our program manager, say that justify that, log it, And then again, we can go back and request that other prod role. So once again, we get this prod role and we will approve it. Now it's approved. Now, as I've been going through this, the system has been recording these requests. So we can see here where we had a pending, where they requested it, it was denied, it was pending again, and then it was approved. So each of these are, part of the audit log events, recording who's requesting, when it was pending, and when it was approved. And that helps us with our traceability, as well as things I mentioned, like, users joining sessions, who joined when, and when they left. So now I have a new status, and each of these cases, I'm getting a new certificate. You notice that before I had an 8-hour certificate. Now I've reduced it down to my 1 hour, which is because it's a more sensitive environment. That's why it's reduced. So in this case, I'm going to go in, but instead of going in as monitor, I want to go in as app user. In this case, I'm going to run what I know to be the right Python script. And we run, and we'll let testing let us know if we're doing any better. Now that was a brief step through of an example of using our approval workflow that a user can access the system, confirm the behaviors of the system and whether or not they're seeing what should be there or not, and then be able to then further their escalation to get access to the right user to start or maintain a process. And that's how we would recommend of not giving direct access to production, maybe not even giving monitoring access, but allowing that escalation and fully auditable method to allow for that. Now, in terms of, how can you work with Teleport? There is both a community and enterprise version. This version I've been using is the enterprise, which includes, our role-based access and approval workflow. There's still plenty of functionality in our community version. We're an open source solution written in Go, as I mentioned. It's available, in our GitHub repository to take a look at. You can see not just our code and issues, but you can see our milestones. What are we working on? What are we working towards? And we're really trying to make a solution that is seamless for users. As you can see, I'm giving secure access, but I'm limited to what I can see to my appropriate role, but I can easily access it once needed. The auditability is convenient both for myself as well as other managers or auditors to go back and see what I did. So there's no question of what occurred through the process. And really helping to not get in the way, make it easier for you. You have certificates, they're portable. It uses your SSO, but it still lets you navigate as easily as you did before, perhaps with static keys. And we're always striving to continue to improve our support for SSH and Kubernetes. We're continuing to look into other protocols that use a very similar approach and integrates well, with your system. You can always check out our GitHub repository here at this address, as well as our website, gravitational.com, that has a lot of resources and videos. You might even see me speaking again on some of those. So, I recommend in terms of next steps, checking out, our role-based access on our documentation. Please do, download Teleport, check it out. And again, you're welcome to go on GitHub. We really enjoy interacting with folks who look for, new ways to use the system, gives us ideas, gives us feedback. We'll put out various requests from the community about what they'd like to see. I know recently we put out something about open policy agent. So there's a lot of very technical things that we get into, and we really want to see what works best in terms of this kind of community and getting real feedback to know what we should be working on next. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen, for that wonderful presentation. And now we would like to enter the Q&A portion of the webinar. First question for you, Stephen, is you mentioned trusted clusters. Will the access the user has have flow through the other clusters as well?
It can. There are a number of options there where you could simply mirror the role and have the exact same role in another cluster. You also can have it where you have a different role, but you can put in tags to say, well, if I have a login from my root cluster, then I do want that to automatically populate in my other role. So it's both the ability to have the same access and then have slightly different access or extended access. And that's both the case for SSH and Kubernetes. So typically you would see a definition that includes, well, my Kubernetes groups and then things like internal. So internal is our way of designating whatever I've listed as my logins, we'll continue that and have that automatically populate. And we've seen a lot of users leverage that for their trusted clusters.
Great, that's good to know. And on a similar login note, another attendee is wondering, can I use my own username instead of the usernames that you showed?
Yes, when we authenticate against an IDP, we receive back the traits. So that's a list of the information, some of it very standard, like username, roles, groups. And as part of that, things like usernames, those can be populated with tags. And during my overview of from simple to more complex role, I had the external dot. So when I have an external meta tag in there, that will allow me to populate, and I could put in things like Stephen or others. For my demonstration, I kept to more static users just so it's clear what they're doing. But often, yes, you would want to use personalized user IDs, and then your PAM integration can, as well as create their individual users, it can also set things like pseudo rights or other privileges.
Awesome, thank you for that. We've got another question here from Jack, and Jack is wondering, can he request access within the web besides the command line?
Yes, currently that's something we're just about to roll out. A feature we're rolling out now for the web would allow you to integrate with one of your plugins, to say, well, I need to request that through the web. So that's our first web integration. And then we expect, soon to release versions that will allow you to say, just as you saw me in the command line, give me a particular role, and then I can wait within the web. And so you'd see more of that full-fledged view of what role you have, what roles you've requested from a web point of view. We typically roll things out first to the command line, make sure that they're working fully there, and then often we migrate that into the web, whether we think that is valuable or we see feedback from our user base.
Interesting. And Stephen, the last question we have for you right now is, you have Auth 0 in your example. What are other single sign-ons that you can use?
Yep. And again, we support SAML or OIDC based, as well as GitHub. Now, when you go into our documentation, you'll notice that we have particular guides on certain ones, and you can definitely use any SAML or OIDC based. We've gone ahead and provided examples such as Azure AD, it's SAML. For Google, I believe it's OIDC. So often you can do both for any of those, but we've given particular guidance. But certainly our customers are using Keycloak, they're using Auth 0, they're using Okta, they're using OneLogin. So all of those are really on the table, and we've tried to provide a lot of guidance there on make sure that it will work and that you can integrate successfully.
Great. And if there are no other questions, with that, DZone would like to thank Stephen for a great presentation. DZone would also like to thank Gravitational for providing the audience with a great webinar. Lastly, thank you to all of our attendees today. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Have a great day.